Hi, this is Nick Rabulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. This is another in a series of interviews we're doing with authors of papers in the journal. In this case, we're interviewing Christopher Martin, who, as a guest editor, is editing a symposium on the thought of Jürgen Habermas and its implications for philosophy of education. So, Christopher, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about the issue.
So Habermas is obviously a major social and political theorist. Is not always seen as as an educational theorist. So maybe we can start by asking you to give a sort of a general overview to the audience of Habermas's project, and then we'll talk specifically about aspects of that project that may be particularly salient for educational theory.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. I mean, I think one of the challenges about kind of condensing an account of the way in which Habermas's work interfaces with education is in part that he's kind of gone through a number of different stages in the development of his work. So he comes from what we sometimes refer to as the Frankfurt School critical theory tradition, very much interested in questions around liberation, emancipation, so on and so forth. But as his career progresses, he becomes more interested in what's sometimes referred to as communicative ethics or formal pragmatics, and very much into with a focus on to reconstruct or re-understand Kant's moral theory. So how that bears on various educational questions, I think, are multiple. So, for example, in Habermas's discourse ethical theory or his theory of communicative action, he's interested in how people who might have very different value sets can deliberate and maybe come to understand each other and perhaps even come to an agreement on basic moral commitments. And so some theorists have argued that this can point the way towards how we can approach developing certain forms of communicative competence and argumentative skills in schools, particularly as we think about children's moral education as well, how they think and reason as moral agents. And then, of course, he has like larger systems theory interests. So he's interested in the extent to which and ways in which institutions might or might not create cultural conditions that enable people to, again, deliberate and communicate in constructive ways. So I think, we can talk about the relevance of Habermas from a curriculum perspective, what kinds of things we actually do in classrooms to foster communicative competence. But we can also take a look at things from a larger policy perspective. What kind of policies would be conducive to the kind of school system that would be promoting community competence? But of course, also, we can talk about things at a much more abstract level, which is to what extent can we actually learn to deliberate and agree on educational values? So there are, I think, multiple layers that you can actually tackle the relationship between Habermas and education generally.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent overview. So let's start a little bit at the abstract level and then come back to the issues of policy and practice, and then we'll talk specifically about some of the papers in the symposium. So this core idea of discourse ethics, that in situations of differing claims about truth, differing claims about value, these are grounded in fundamentally communicative processes by which people work through their differences or disagreements in seeking a more consensual agreement around what is true, what is good, and that these communicative processes are the only foundation that there is or can be to these kinds of claims. Can you say a little bit more about what it means philosophically to put those communicative processes sort of at the heart of these philosophical questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I suppose maybe there are two ways we could cash that out. One, for example, which I think is quite interesting, is if you take what is sometimes referred to as Habermas's proceduralism, like really seriously in the way you've described it, that there is no substantive starting point when people are in disagreement about moral claims. This positions, I think, the role of the philosopher in certain forms of normative argumentation very differently, and I think that extends to philosophers of education as well. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, Habermas, I think, draws a distinction between a philosopher who's trying to clarify the communicative conditions whereby people with two very different perspectives could potentially arrive at an agreement on basic values reasons, right? So that's kind of one level of analysis. But then, of course, Habermas would say that when the philosopher starts making substantive claims, right, about, like, again, what should be on curriculum or what the aims of education should be, that's not necessarily a philosophical position. That is the philosopher as a citizen just taking their best shot at a decent argument that hopefully they can persuade other people of. Because if you're committed to the Habermas's proceduralism, then you actually have to practice Habermas's proceduralism as well. So I think that's one way in which I think it bears out in terms of the philosophical analysis of education on a procedural.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I mean, for again, audiences who maybe haven't read Habermas, there are echoes here of some claims that John Dewey makes. There are echoes here of some of the later work of John Rawls and political liberalism. This idea that communicative processes are at the heart of these, as you say, procedural norms about how we achieve understanding and agreement around these things. There's echoes of that in other theories as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
So let's talk about the sort of the next level down then. You've already touched on this, which is how this might have implications for educational practice and educational policy. So if we think these communicative processes are crucial, then clearly one of the goals of education has to be, for, especially for in democratic societies, preparing citizens to be able to participate effectively in these kinds of conversations. Can you say more about how that might look in the context of education?
Yeah, certainly. And I think, what you said earlier about the maybe drawing comparisons to thinkers like Dewey can be a helpful starting point in tracking some of the differences or the relevance of the Habermasian perspective on this. I mean, remember, Habermas sees, disagreement on basic values as an epistemic problem primarily. So it's not as if, we can describe, disagreements about values as being about conflicting interests, but he's interested in the epistemic quandary where, okay, I agree, I believe one thing, you believe another thing, but we don't know what the answer is. And so one, I think, important implication of that, educationally speaking, is one thing you really want to work on cultivating amongst young people is a sense of which they need to take what he sometimes refers to as a hypothetical attitude, one's own values and commitments. So it's kind of maybe similar to the sort of the autonomy arguments you might see in political liberalism with a more stronger emphasis in the epistemic dimension. So by hypothetical attitude, I mean, yes, of course, one has internalized certain value orientations, one has certain interests, but it is necessary and sometimes appropriate to kind of stand back from that and recognize your own fallibility and recognize what it might be if one were to really observe the values that you're committed to across a society. So this enables, I think, Habermas's view to open space for deliberation with others, because instead of doubling down on your commitments, you have to be able to step back and go, okay, what is actually the case, or what is justifiable? So I think there's the relationship that the learner would have with their moral commitments. And then, of course, there's what I referred to earlier, which would be what you might identify as certain communicative competences. These can include, we can cash them out or describe them differently. Habermas is very formal about these. He refers to these rules of discourse or dialogue that you have to observe in order to get to some kind of agreement. But what you could do is ask what that could look like in a substantive sense. So he sometimes refers to the importance of what's called reciprocal role taking. So it's not enough for me to argue my position. It's to say, okay, if I were in Nick's situation, what would be in his best interest? So I have to be able to do that in order to facilitate dialogue. And there's a number of different competences, I think, that you can identify through that approach.
Yeah, easy to see how that would relate to certain kinds of educational goals as well. Okay, so let's stand back a little bit and let's look at the symposium set as a whole. You have a really outstanding collection of authors in this set. We're not going to talk about every single paper here, but can you talk just in broad terms about what were your goals in putting this symposium together? How do you see the different papers sort of holding together in terms of an exegesis of Habermas's ideas, again, in the context of educational problems?
Yeah, I think the way in which I think they hang together in particular is one of the things we were interested in a group is what I kind of describe as maybe a bit of a paradox in Habermas's theory, which is, when we're talking about his discourse ethical project in particular, he says that, you don't always be wanting to have this hypothetical attitude about your moral values and norms, but there's going to be situations where people are going to be in value conflicts and they just don't seem to have any apparent common ground. All they have in common is the fact that they can communicate with each other. So given maybe some of the things going on in the political cultures of liberal democracies, we seem to be converging on the very kind of practical situation that Habermas is describing, and I think it has cascaded through all sorts of institutional spaces, including educational spaces. And one would think that a discourse ethic could be a really helpful way to think through these problems and maybe even provide action guiding suggestions to practitioners and policymakers. But it is at the same time really difficult, I think, in fractious political times to get people to communicate with each other in the first place. So I think one of the things that all the papers are really kind of engaged in is trying to tease apart how a discourse ethical project or a commitment to a discourse ethic could actually be operationalized or thought through in more concrete ways at different levels. So we have authors talking about debates in the university context, or in schooling, or in children's moral development, and so on, where, or even, for example, Julian Kolb's paper talks about the role in which the rise of digital media has really had pronounced effects on the sense in which one is really uncertain where one ends up standing on any number of issues. So that's, I think, if the ethos of that of our symposium is to sort of say, how can a discourse ethic inform some of the problems we're encountering in what might one describe as very politicized times?
I think we all recognize these times in this context. Absolutely. Can you summarize first the names of the other participants in this set?
Yeah, so I mentioned Julian earlier. Julian Kolb is one of our contributors. Then we also have Gertrude Nutter-Winkler. Then we have myself as a contributor, Krasimir Stojanov, Anina Laviska, and Darren Kelly.
Yeah, thank you for this summary, Chris. There's a lot more in the set, obviously, that we could talk about in this short interview. I really do want to encourage people to look at the full issue. A lot of really outstanding papers in this collection, and thank you for your work in drawing this group of people together.
Oh, you're welcome, and thanks very much for the opportunity to talk through the issue. I'm really pleased with the contributions, and people really brought their A game. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Welcome.